the challenge for us is that messy middle, right? Is how do I find what's most important when there's not a catastrophe or something that is calling me to that clarity? And we still need to work on those big resets so that we can transition more quickly to what matters most and with less heartache. But that's where the work and the resets come, is not just in those big moments. I came to realize that each of those little resets that we can do every single day help us to take aligned action, that help us to be focused on those more meaningful results. If we don't take them, today we're caught up in autopilot and distracted by this, that, and everything, not even just our phones. There's so many things that are there to distract us, take up our energy if we're not really intentional about it.
Hello and welcome back to the Connected Mindset Live. I'm your host, Greg Tomczyk. Another great week to be on the show with you guys and share really a fascinating person, mission, and some fascinating thoughts that I think are really going to shift whatever you're doing forward and move that needle, which is why we wake up in the morning and be able to make some of that progress. And we have Miss Penny Zenker on with us this morning. And Penny, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's so great to be here, Greg. I'm so pumped.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's gonna be an exciting one. I definitely have my notebook out. I know a lot of folks will, and there's a lot of business owners that are looking to be more focused and be able to be better about managing and thinking about their energy, because we always talk about positive energy throughout our community, and people know when good energy is around and when bad energy is around. But how do we create that? How do we be able to be conscious of those types of energies and be open to it and not shut down? So I'm really looking forward to dive into some of those angles, Penny. But one of the ways we like to start the show is, what mission are you on, and what are you hoping that each person listening in today walks away with?
Well, I call myself a focusologist, and so that's part of my mission, which is to for myself and for others, because we are really in a focus crisis. So it's to control and direct my focus and to help others to control and direct their focus to create more meaningful results in our lives. And with this new book, I kind of call it the Reset Revolution, like really, to be a part of a reset revolution so that we make more reset moments. That's like the core. If we can just remember to make more reset moments, and that's what people walk away with, that's going to help them to be more focused on what matters most in every area of their life.
Yeah, I love that. How did you come to that conclusion? What was your lead up to say this is something that people really need? And maybe you needed it at some point in your journey, and then you started sharing it with the folks that you consult with and that were in your network, and it just grew from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that these, when we have a passion and a mission that we are on, it usually doesn't start from that place in the beginning, right? It finds its way to this. It's like this new book that I wrote. I didn't start out writing that book. I thought I started out writing the book about how we live the 80-20 rule. Yeah. And I realized that if I looked back at, because I utilize the 80-20 rule to constantly ask the question, what's the 20% that makes 80% of the difference? And, and so, but in writing a book, right, you're really taking a step back to see, where did this come from? How do I communicate this in the most simplest way? And as I went back to look at sort of where's the origin story and all of that, I realized that the common thread through my life has been this element of focus and this element of reset. And I didn't realize that they went together
Yeah.
until it did, right? It's like all of a sudden it clicks, and then you're like, oh my God, how did I miss this? This is totally connected. And it started, when I was 19 with the death of my father. It was an accident. It was a tragic accident, and I think that was one of the first major times that I got, when we have these big events in our lives or big resets, it becomes very clear what's most important. And, like if something were to come up in your life where someone needed you, it was a health crisis or whatever, you drop everything and, what's important. The challenge for us is that messy middle, right? Is how do I find what's most important when there's not a catastrophe or something that is calling me to that clarity? Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. Yeah.
And so that's where most of the work gets to be done. We still need to work on those big resets so that we can transition more quickly to what matters most and with less heartache. But
Mhm.
but that's where the work and the resets come, is not just in those big moments. I came to realize that each of those little resets that we can do every single day help us to take aligned action, that help us to be focused on those more meaningful results. But if we don't take them, today we're caught up in autopilot and distracted by this, that, and everything. And not even just our phones, but the political situation, the
Mhm.
social environment that we're in. There's so many things that are there to distract us, to mentally and emotionally, take up our energy if we're not really intentional about it.
Mhm. Yeah, it's such a fascinating thought for all of us to wrap our minds around, when it comes to that power of choice. I think that power of choice is so important. When you talk about the resets that stick out to me as a person, they were forced from the outside. So like it was like early on, I was in college and lost my sister, and that was a reset of what is life after college and athletics. What does it really embody and mean? And it opens your mind up to a whole new world, and that leads you to your next step. And it's fascinating how the forced resets are so powerful because we're not expecting them. But you're talking about potentially intentionally creating resets throughout it so that you can kind of refresh. And what does that look like when you need a reset? I guess timeline wise, a lot of people are so. I think a lot of people want to be regimented. I know in the athletic world, we were on like by the hour like routine, so we're just like used to somebody telling us, here's what you need to do at this hour. So is there a timeline that you say every 6 months or every year, or is it more of a internal feeling that somebody has to have to say, I've reached my limit or my capacity. Now I need to have an intentional reset.
Well, let's look at it this way. How are New Year's resolutions working for us?
Mm-hmm.
Are they working?
Yeah.
No, right? And that's if we set them once a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and we know that today we don't have the time. If you set goals or reset once a year, and many people do, and that's great, and you should continue doing that, but we need to do them more often because things are changing so fast. One of the biggest mistakes I made in my own career was I was in application development and technology, and I had this amazing product that I was creating. It was called Show and Tell, and it was about how to um, make your slides in PowerPoint, to make them more like a database, so that you could, instead of recreating the wheel over and over again like people do, especially in large organizations, that they could search for a keyword and they would get all the slides that are related to that, so they could then load them into a presentation, right? And there'd be this. So it was amazing, right? I did it because
Yeah.
I needed it, but I got so lost in the one plan that I created in the beginning. This is the technology that we're going to use, and this is the how we're going to follow it. And I wasn't trained in technology. I kind of learned as I went, and I didn't have like a user group that helped me to test this along the way. So I took too much time. And by the time it flopped, because
Yeah.
A, the technology had changed and I was going to have to redevelop it in a new platform. And B, I was too in my plan, right? So it's in my new book, what I talk about is it's about dynamic reassessment. That's a lesson I've been learning throughout my whole life, is that it's not about effort and persistence. I mean, it is, right? You're in athletics, you know that you have to bring the effort and persistence. But if we stop and take more resets along the way, then we're going to be able to take in that feedback about what's working and what's not and immediately integrate it. So you asked, when do we do that? We do it every time we make a mistake and every time we have a success, so that we can learn from what went well when we did it well and keep doing that, and what didn't go well. We learn when we're frustrated, like what's causing us angst, what is not in alignment, when we're exhausted, when we get a reaction from someone that isn't what we expected. You know, how do we respond? That's a moment for a reset. What's going on? Did I say something that triggered somebody? How could I say this differently? Hold on a second. Maybe I can restate that. It might not have been received in the way that I intended it. So there's so many ways that we can reset when we become a professional noticer, to notice when these signals are there, because they're there all the time.
Mm-hmm. And most people shut them off.
We shut them off, or we go on autopilot. Like you said, there's routines. You get into those routines, and then those routines may not be serving you in the same way, because you're not intentional about what you're doing anymore, right? So you're doing the routine, and that's better than not having a routine at all. But are you getting the most out of each and every workout or each and every session that you're doing if you're in autopilot?
Yeah. Yeah. Where do you think it intersects with like emotional intelligence? Because, you know, a lot of this, being able to ask yourself those right questions, and it's almost a self-discovery process. But when it comes to, you know, somebody kind of thinking how it's going to play out, you know, how have you kind of thought about the linkages between those two?
Absolutely. I mean, the number one reason why we're not focused, well, I should say there's clarity, right,
Yeah.
into what it is that we want to achieve. But when we
Mhm.
have that clarity, the next thing is, what's distracting you, right? And distractions very often, more than not, are not just the things that are around us externally, they're internally. Like, we're our own worst
Yeah.
enemy in most cases, right? It's like
Yeah.
we have this self-doubt and we psych ourselves out that, you know, we suck, we're not going to make the team, or, you
Mhm.
know, whatever it is that the story that's going on, or the limiting belief that's in front of us. And how energy is connected is that, if we think about it, is at any moment, you mentioned choice, is we have a choice as to which story we want to choose. And the first one is usually, I don't remember who came up with the ants, cants, and buts, the automatic negative thoughts
Mhm.
that come up. That's the ant, right? And that leads to the cants and the buts. We have the choice if we're conscious of it. So our very first step is to be conscious of what energy are we in. And we can, I talk about this in my TEDx, the energy of thought, is that if that choice is available to us at any moment, it's to recognize which one we're choosing, because the direction of our energy, if we think about it, is the first domino that would positively influence every action and interaction that we have. So if I walk into a meeting, a controversial meeting, or a negotiation, or uh, an audition for something, or something like that, and I feel like I'm not going to get it, that's going to impact every action and interaction I have during that period. But if I go in there and I intentionally create what I call a reset moment, right? This is an intentional reset moment to tap into why I deserve this, why I have the capabilities and skill sets, right? Instead of reminding ourselves in that moment and focusing, if you think about it, on what I don't have, right? That sets off and shuts off everything that we do have.
It
So we
does.
just need to turn and shift our focus. That's what I believe is the key of focus. Is it's about attention and intention being aligned with the direction that we're going in, right? So attention, intention, and direction is what focus is. So in that moment, I can say, okay, what's the aligned actions? Who do I need to be? And what do I need to tap into within myself that's already there to bring the right energy so that I can make those connections with people, so that I can show up at my best. You can still be nervous. There's a difference to being like a positive nervous, like excited, to being a point where it holds you back, where it's fear, right? There's that
Yeah.
fine line between fear and excitement, and you can make that shift.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, the attention, intention, and direction. I haven't heard that put that clearly before, and we recently did like an analysis of the most common words used throughout all of our episodes, and that one word that has been said the most is clarity.
Mm,
And I think there's just so many unclarities and uncertainties in the world that just get adopted into that's, take up a lot of our mental capacity, and then we really don't have anything else to give to creation and innovation and all these things we really want to do to push the world forward. And so it's a huge blocker. It really is. Have you seen any good examples of breakthroughs from just being able to do this more frequently? I know people want to do it, but creating that, once they create the habit of like being able to feel it and say, I need a reset, and then to be that conscious, I think is a superpower in today's world.
it is a superpower, and like any superpower or athletics, or right, every musician, every athlete, every artist, anybody with a unique skill, they've honed and developed that skill.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's all it takes is practice. And what I say to people, and in my book, I talk about, there's the recognizing of the reset moment. And then when you call it that and you're intentional about it, it triggers a 3-step intuitively. It triggers a 3-step mental model, which is to step back, to get perspective, and to realign. And so the first is to start noticing, because it will trigger it, right? And it'll help you to get perspective in the moment and to take aligned action. Um, but here's the thing is we always think we're going to do it perfectly the first time, right? I'm going to get out there, and I'm going to hit a home run every time I go out there, and it's going to be perfect. No, right? So we might not notice it until after it happened. Oh my goodness, I could have totally done that differently. Okay, that's great. You're starting to notice. So how can you notice more when you could have done that differently? Because what's going to happen is, by taking that reflection and saying, how could I have done that differently? And here's what I'm going to focus on next time. Here's how I can do it better next time. By putting it immediately into action, then you're going to start to notice it. The more that you notice, you're going to start to notice it in the moment, right? So you're going to be faster in your recognition. So I'm going to say something that's off, and I'm going to say, oh, can I restate that? Or I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. And you start to get then more comfortable in other ways of interrupting that negative pattern, let's call it, a
Mhm.
way, a trigger that comes up in a certain way. Hey, and be honest and vulnerable about it. That just triggered me. I'm sorry. Let me restate that. And you'll notice it in the moment. Here's the beauty of it. The more that you practice it and it becomes just a part of who you are, you're going to remember it before it happens, and you're going to catch the bubble in your head, and you're going to be able to squash the bubble before it actually comes out of your mouth.
Yeah.
Now, we're human. Is that going to happen 100% of the time? No. You know, uh, I mean, I talk about this. I practice this on a regular basis. Do I get triggered and by certain people in my life? Absolutely. But I know that with certain people that I know trigger me, then I know I have to be even more on alert to notice if I have an intention. If that relationship is important to me, then I'm going to be that much more conscious. What can I do to avoid? So we set up things ahead of time. That's
Mhm.
instead of just expecting us to know what to do in the moment, we set it up ahead of time. So a great example, and I use this in my book, but it was super helpful to me as a parent, is, there's this thing called 1, 2, 3 magic. So I used to feel when my kids would misbehave, I would take it personally, and it would get me angry, and I would respond, and I felt out of control. I felt like a bad mom, like all these things, right, come up. And then I'm like, no, I just need a way to handle it. And the minute that I had a strategy, okay, I give them a warning, one, second warning, two, and then three means they go into timeout. That's so it took my stress in those moments down to it just changed the what's the word that I use? It changed the intensity
Yeah.
of the moment. And
Mhm.
you mentioned emotional intelligence earlier. That makes us more, as soon as we reduce the intensity, we've gone out of fight or flight, and we're now in the executive function of our brain that can do problem solving. So I can then access that and say, okay, this is how we're going to handle it. It's not personal. I just go into that. Or I learned something else where we'd get into a heated argument, and I would just say, I love you too much to argue, instead of letting it spiral into we have differing opinions on this. I love you too much to argue. Let's come back to this. And so those are how we can use reset moments, is to engage in the strategies that we've decided work for us or that we want to explore.
Mhm. Yeah, those are all very tactical as well. I'm sure the framework's in the book, and we're gonna definitely put that in the show notes. Um, how did your practice start? I'm curious, and also interested in the parenting angle, which we can go down as well, because it sounds like that was to be able to lower the intensity as a parent is huge. Um,
Huge, right? And I
but
was a
what?
single mom for a long time, so
Mhm.
it was all on me. The
Yeah.
father was
Mhm.
living overseas, so they were 100% with me.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely an interesting angle. But Penny, I'm interested in how your practice started, and then how people obviously can. We'll get to how they can implement it into their own lives, through the book and through checking out your website and some of your talks. But did you start practicing it, and we're like, wow, there's something here, or did you have a mentor that was kind of practicing the frameworks that you use, and you adopted some of it, kind of took pieces of different strategies? What did that practice look like for Penny to be able to discover that there's value in what you're delivering here?
Totally. Mark Twain has a statement that he said, I would have made it shorter if I had more time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it took me up to this point in my life to recognize that it's just those 3 steps. I did, and I have a lot of different strategies and practices, but in looking to how can I teach others and what is it that I've done with my clients over the years, I'm just very practical and pragmatic. And so I was able to distill these 3 steps out of every practice that I use goes through this mental model. So, but it started, actually, it even started before my father's death, in the sense of the college that I chose to go to. So, so somewhere, right? It's all these things we don't
Mhm.
always know, but when I thought about it, that's probably the first time that I interacted with this idea of dynamic reassessment. I just didn't know it. Is So I chose to go to Drexel University, and at the time there were only 2 schools in the country that had a co-op program. It was a work study program. And what was important to me is I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And but I wasn't really sure, because I didn't, other than watching TV and seeing, these, this is what a trial lawyer looks like. Well, that looks exciting. I think I want to do that. And so I wanted to go to a school where I could dip my toes in and learn about that profession before I actually got out. And my brothers, after they got out of school, they didn't really know what they were going to do. It was hard to find a job. it would be a lot easier to find a job if I already had a year and a half to 2 years of experience, right? Getting out with this co-op program. So that practical side of me said, okay, it's learning by doing. Let's dive in and learn from that and then adapt as we go.
Mhm.
And then I took this class, which was called Learning by Doing. And it actually took the members of the class and put us in different committees in the city. So I was on the homeless committee that was working on how to help to bring homeless off the streets. And you learn so much when you're actually working in the reality of how things work. Because we can read a textbook, and it was the same in my technology business. I can learn how to code a program, but when it runs on that hardware, on that server, lots of things interact with it, and the way that you're supposed to do it that's supposed to work doesn't work. Right? So getting homeless off the streets was not a simple thing. And there was a lot of politics involved, which makes things work differently. So that was a huge eye-opening experience to see how things really work and put another notch in that it has to be about dynamic reassessment. It's learning as we're going, learning as the reality, and how do we use that. And so, um, I don't know if I answered the question there,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it's sort of that's where it
definitely.
started. And then
Mhm.
it just kind of unfolds like an onion. You get the next layer. Each of us has a thread in our life, and that just happens to be my thread. It's how I
Mhm.
interpret everything is through
Yeah.
this focus and dynamic reassessment.
Mhm.
And I didn't realize it until a couple of years ago.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. So getting to that point, because, I talk to a lot of people, we obviously change careers, we, try different things. We do a number of activities to try to find that thing that our story has really been telling us the whole time, but maybe we've been pushing it off. I know, a lot of my friends at all ages, people in their 60s or people in their 20s, they're all still looking for it. Um, they're still looking for that thing. Is there any recommendations or anything that you found useful as you were kind of coming to that discovery of, focus and reset is the thread of my life, but I haven't really, focused on it or dedicated to that specifically. So I'm going to, you know, kind of dive into that head first and that be 100%.
Well, that's a great question, right? We're all looking for a silver bullet in every area. I think, um, there was a point in my life where when I made the decision to move, I lived in Zurich, Switzerland, where I had my IT company for 16 years. And there was a point where I decided to move for various different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, I was working as a senior executive at a large market research company. And so as I came back, I was exploring what I was going to do next. And so I think that what happened when I came back is I was planting a lot of seeds. So I was doing some workshops and checking out sort of speaking in front of people. I was doing some coaching, one-on-one, and seeing how that felt. And so I had my hands in a bunch of different pots. And I remember my brother, who's a marketer, he said, "You can't do this." He said, "If you want to be successful, you have to focus on one thing." And I started to get really anxious. I thought about it, what he said, and I got really upset and anxious for that day. When you think, "Oh, I'm doing it all wrong. What am I supposed to do? I have no idea what I want to do." So it just created more anxiety. But the interesting thing is I went to bed that night, and when I woke up the next morning, I felt this inner calm. And that inner calm was my gut telling me I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I don't need to be dialed in if I'm in the exploration phase, right? There's a dialed in phase. So there's a time I was clear, and I learned there's a time to zoom in and a time to zoom out. And this was a zoom out phase. I was testing, I was exploring, I was reflecting, how does this feel when I do this? And so we have to leave space for each of those phases. And because we get this thought that focus is just about zooming in. And sometimes we're so zoomed in that we miss the big picture.
Yeah.
We miss the opportunity, or so we need to be able to be flexible to do both. And that experience really taught me to just to be present, like, and reflect, right? Make these reset moments times where I'm reflecting and checking in with, how is this working for me? Do I feel like there's one direction that feels more right to me? And sometimes, and really they all kind of converged. And then I was able to see, okay, this is where I want to build my career for now, and where is that going to go to? But sometimes we don't know where that's going to go to. And so you talked about clarity earlier.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, there's a path to clarity, but I think sometimes we get misunderstood that clarity means we have to know the end goal. Sometimes clarity is just about clarity in the next step. And that's the beauty of these resets, is that you can have an idea of where that end goal might be, but that might change. But your reset is keeping you in aligned action to where you believe it to be right now. Somebody yesterday gave me a great analogy. Mary Crafts. I had her on my podcast, and I thought it was a great analogy. She was going on a hike to Kilimanjaro, and she said that 90% of the time, the summit was out of view. So you knew you were going to the summit. You knew kind of where it was and kind of what it looks like. But you don't see it most of the time. So you have to focus on the path and each step. And so just the last thing on that is, in my talks, I bring in the hot cold game. I compare it, to a regular game of hide and seek. And so, for those who might not be familiar with the hot cold game, it's a game we play as a kid. There's something hidden in the room. The kid comes in all excited, looking for the object. And with every few steps that they take, or maybe every individual step, they get structured feedback that tells them whether they're hotter or colder. And that gives them the ability to decide, based on that feedback, am I going to continue going forward? If it's warmer, then I'm likely going to go in that direction, right? If it's colder, I'm going to shift and change new directions. That's just the game of life. One step at a time, and listen for that feedback. And that's the idea of these reset moments, to be moments to stop and listen for that feedback, to be able to find the signal through the noise, because there's a lot of noise out there. So we have to give ourselves space for that, whether it's for us personally in our lives, whether it's about our relationships, whether it's in our business. Those reset moments, they help us to take aligned action with that next step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so fascinating how you started with the question of, the 80-20 rule, or how can you focus on something to get 80% of the results. And then you came to almost a formula, step by step, to help people zoom out and then receive the feedback when they're zoomed out. So when they zoom back in, they're that much, better off, as opposed to not zooming out enough. And then you just kind of ruminate in in negativity, which I think is what a lot of people do. So I think
Sure.
it's fascinating how you kind of walk through that journey and were able to ask a big question on, how do we, either get more done or accomplish more or have more fulfillment, with a focused approach, as opposed to doing a bunch of things and getting, that 20% and it switching around. So I think it's fascinating that you came to that. I think zooming out is so important. I know for myself, when I was playing baseball, I got to a point where I started to trust myself enough to ask the coaches, where do you see me? Where can I improve? What am I terrible at? Like, I want to know. And if you
Yeah.
don't get that feedback, you never know. And I've taken that into my business life, to just ask for feedback. And we're always surprised at how much we grow when we get that feedback. And I just think that's so important to resetting, because if you're still curious about, there's still so many open items that you want to ask about, it's going to be hard to kind of wipe the slate, not necessarily clean, but wipe it fresh and kind of have that reset that you need to continue to go forward in a focused manner.
Yeah, I'm sure you tried new things too, right? Maybe you watched another player who was
Yeah.
really, excelling and going, okay, if you didn't ask them, you're watching, you're looking, what are they doing?
Mhm.
How are they holding the bat differently? Sometimes people stand differently, right? There's all these different, what's their ritual, that
Yeah.
they do
Yeah.
before they get up to bat or whatever the thing is in as a pitcher or any position. And maybe you even have the courage to ask them, right? Like I've had the courage sometimes to be vulnerable and say, hey, it's hard to ask a peer or somebody that you really respect, right? Could you watch me doing this and tell me what you would do differently? And then it's hard to mix it up. Like if you're going to change something that you're used to doing, that's hard.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
growth is not always easy, right?
Yeah.
And you won't know unless you put it into practice and test it.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say growth is a hard sell. It's it's people don't really buy it by choice, a lot of the times. But once you get to a point where you choose the struggle, choose the pain, choose the obstacle that you're going to have to go through, um, I think it really helps to create a little bit of calmness around growth, which I think that's where we can when we're not necessarily safe and secure in growth, because I think we need some of that bouncing outside of those boundaries a little bit to feel the difference between unsafe and safe, or secure and unsecure. But I think it's so fascinating when it gets to that level where you can have calmness and in growth and intentionally reset. And that's what you're kind of
Exactly.
alluding to. And but I think a lot of people are in fight or flight, and they think a reset is like creating more trauma, more struggle for them, so they're not choosing it. But um, that may be something you talk about in your book on
I never heard
that
that.
that
I
mindset.
I
Hmm.
never heard that. So I'm interested in exploring that with you. Like
Yeah.
most people, they want to reset.
Hmm.
Like please, like because there's a certain freedom that comes with the word because it means kind of putting the past in the past and moving forward. So tell me more about where you might think that because I've never
Yeah.
heard that where they might feel like it's more work or
I've seen that a lot in athletics. When people get out of athletics, um, they find that if they reset, they're going to lose their identity, and they're so
Mhm.
attached to that identity that obviously they can do that dynamic reassessment and kind of do the small resets. But I don't think they get the big reset, because once it starts to get painful, they go back to that identity, and it's hard to get away from that. I've seen that with a lot of athletes, a lot
That
of
makes
people in the military, because we do a lot of skill bridge type things, and they only know one way. So going out of their way to intentionally reset seems like more pain that they're volunteering for. Which is, it's kind of an interesting perspective. I don't think it's everybody, but just in the communities I've seen who have to make drastic pivots from, like,
right.
being an athlete, getting tutored every day, to going to get a full-time job, and nobody's telling you or holding your hand, and it's hard for
Right,
them
it's
to
the
get away from.
uncertainty, right? You've
Yeah.
had success.
Hmm.
Success can kill our ambition
Yeah.
and our desire to because we feel vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
We were successful, so what if we're not the next time, right? So it's that level of uncertainty. Can I do it again? Can I make a name for myself? Is this who I am? And that is a challenge. And I guess that comes back to your clarity.
Yeah.
So you don't have certainty in where you're headed, but I like to say fall back on the practice, on the reset practice of stepping back, getting perspective and realigning and knowing that hot or colder, right? Just knowing that you're going to get there, you just need to be paying attention. And
Hmm.
maybe we play it as a game a little bit, right? I mean, does that help a little bit if you were to make this as a more of a game and not
Hmm.
as personal? Um, does
Yeah.
that like what
Yeah.
helps? What do you think helps the athletes and the military people that you work with? What helps them make that reset? What's some of the mindset shifting that happens there?
Yeah, a lot of it's micro achievement. They're so linked to, like you mentioned, that macro achievement. So those that next step. You said, like, really being in the next step and having clarity on that, but knowing there's, a peak that you can't see. I think that hit the nail on the head. Most of them just need that. They're like, hey, I want to do this next, but that's all they see. They don't see the micro steps, because they're not, what I say, they're not doing the dark work. They're not doing the hard work because they're kind of shying away from it because it looks big. They have to go up to something they can't see. So they're like, oh, I'll just stay down here and, not try to go to the peak, because they're holding back. But that's where fear comes in. And I think resets and zooming out, it a lot of times for me has helped eliminate fear. Like, I'll have a little bit of fear, going into a speaking engagement, or when I was going to pitch in front of thousands of people, and I would basically have to, I'd have to do that zoom out, reset practice before going out to that event. And I think we all have something that we can use like that in our daily lives, not just professionally.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was thinking about, fear, right? Is that intensity. We talked about reducing the intensity so that we can look at it more clearly, right? So it's what ways can we take that fear and minimize it? Like, I like to look at, well, has anyone else done this before? Like, am I the only one to go after that? And if I'm not, then there's a path. I can go look for those people who've done it and get their advice, or read a book, that tells me about how they did it. So I think there's so many ways, if we recognize it, okay, there's fear here. Again, coming back to that professional noticer, it's reducing that intensity so that we can find the resourcefulness that we already have inside of us. We're all creative in so many different ways. It's just sometimes it's blocked by that fear.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think the principles you talk about are also so relevant to parenting, which I also associate with leadership in an organization, and how important it is for leaders today to have this, and it's only getting more important.
Totally.
From what you've seen, do most high level leaders have this capability or these practices, in their routine, or is it one of those things that is still kind of becoming more of a conscious practice and kind of that higher level executive suite, which is a lot of stress, a lot of, not resetting. It's you're always dialed in to the thing at hand, and kind of bouncing around.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a couple directions I could go with this. So one of the first things around business in general, this is leaders and individuals, is through my research, I found that 70% of people's biggest challenge is competing priorities.
Yeah.
And, and that is a leadership problem, an individual leadership problem, but also an overarching leadership problem. Because if people don't know what their priorities are, because really, what is that telling you? It's telling you have no priorities. Because if they're competing with one another, then it means you have no criteria that determines this is more important than that. And potentially, you're also not giving people mechanisms to discuss it. If it involves, like, let's say I'm a project manager and I work across multiple projects. Very often people don't, they fear, if I ask a question, I'm just going to have to work all night to get all this done, as opposed to going back to the people that I report to and asking, this happened today where this became more urgent on this project. Do we have any flexibility, or what can we do to change the priorities, right? How can we negotiate sometimes? And there is room sometimes for negotiation, or creative thinking, right? We don't ask the question. We just assume and take it on ourselves. And so that's a leadership issue that leaders need to recognize, that people are doing this. And that's why they're burning out, and how they can take more controls to support people to have clear priorities. How do they set them? How do they check in with them? How do they report when there's a problem? And how, as leaders, can we eliminate false urgencies, because those are one of the biggest things that also, right, are those competing priorities. All these people saying, I need this now. And so there's so many practical things that leaders can do, but they're not seeing that as something that is their responsibility. So that's a shift in focus that leaders can really take on first, is how to help people to set priorities and make sure that they're, again, I come back to the words aligned action, that they're taking aligned action. So that means that they're knowing that they're focusing on the things that matter most first. And that is going to help, a line of sight from wherever they are in the organization up to the top goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's I don't know if you've heard of Gino Wickman's book Traction and the
Mm-hmm.
Entrepreneurial Operating System, but he talks a lot about that upward swing of getting to a point of clarity there. So I think that's fascinating that you mentioned that. What about parenting? When it comes to the focusing and the lowering the intensity, all of these things. Is there anything in your book about parenting, or have you done any talks specifically to how this, shift in, the way you're able to zoom out and the way you're able to give feedback and get feedback, and, how that impacts parents?
I use a couple of parenting examples, like the
Mhm.
one that I shared earlier.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more for, there's a lot more around leaders and day-to-day situations.
Mhm.
But I obviously, as a single mom, I've learned a lot, and I found a lot of really great strategies. So I'm happy to share a number of strategies. I think it's first, let's come to that annoying saying that how you do something is how you do
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
There's some truth to that.
Mhm.
So if you start doing it in one area of your life and you're noticing, you're going to notice more as a parent. If you start reducing the intensity at work and in other interactions, it's going to happen as a parent. So wherever you start doing it, like people often, like as an athlete, right? You have certain practices and routines that really work, that helped you, be a top athlete. And some of those strategies we forget are cross contextual. Well, geez, what if I brought that discipline and those routines into how I start my day at work, or how I walk into the house and approach my family, right? There's intention, there's discipline, right? There's purpose, um and so I would say the reducing the intensity comes from recognizing what's working and what's not working. So um my son has been my teacher for the most part, more so than my daughter,
Mhm.
because he was more challenging. And so early on, and this is really where it started for me in the family. Early on, when my daughter was first born, and he was very aggressive and angry. And if I would get angry back, because you know how sometimes energy is
Mhm.
contagious. We were talking about the
Absolutely.
energy of thought. So that's the challenge too, is when I'm in a thought and I'm angry and I come at someone, I'm going to get that type of reaction back. It's very few people that have that emotional intelligence that can be calm and say, "Hey, what's going on?" And
Yeah.
the way we reduce the intensity is we tap into our heart. Is this is a relationship that matters, and I can't focus on the behavior but the relationship and the care, right? That's where I love you too much to argue brought me right into my heart, so that I wouldn't engage and let him trigger me. But my goal was to reduce his intensity, because he would just fly off the wall, and then he would be punching through wall. It was
Mhm.
a danger to himself and to others. So I would try different things, right? First, realizing this is a behavior and that I couldn't allow myself to be triggered, because what would happen is I would intensify his anger. Any negative reaction or intensity that came from me would intensify his reaction, which is true in life, right? If we're going to have a negotiation, or the way that we're communicated feedback, if it's If it's brought in a negative way, it's going to trigger us and create a negative reaction in us, or an emotional reaction. So, that was first, is recognize that he is emotional and that I needed to stay non-emotional. And then I tried lots of different things. I would grab him from behind and I would just hug him. And I would just, instead of me trying to do any other things, people were like, oh, you should just punish him and lock him in his room, or the timeout wasn't working.
Yeah.
I would just grab him from behind. I would hug him really tight. And I would say, I love you, in his ear. I love you. Now, he was 3 or 5 and I could overpower him, right? So I could do it at those times. For an older child, it might need to be something else, right? That's where we developed into I love you too much to argue. That came later when he was older. But as a young child, your goal is just to reduce the intensity in the moment. And then you can decide how you're going to deal with it from there. So I don't know if that was if I answered the question, but it's finding those strategies that work for you, but it's about managing the intensity for yourself and for others.
Yeah, I haven't heard it put in that context, to manage the intensity, and I've seen it with coaches, I've seen it with leaders, I've seen it with parents, I've seen it with people throughout communities and society. And it's one of those things that is fundamental, but it's hard to get there. I think it takes the practices. So I want everybody to go check out your book. I think it sounds like there's a lot of tactical items and stories that they can implement immediately with some of the things you've laid out today. Penny, any final thoughts for business owners or people looking to grow to that next step where they can intentionally reset?
So I think one of the things I want to say is, what helps me to zoom out is that I'm always focused on how do I add value. That the fundamental of dynamic reassessment is about the value, the goal, the bigger picture. And the best way to zoom out and get out of ourselves, or feeling personal, or getting trapped in the task of things, and in that hyper focus that has us lose sight, is just to be looking for, how do I create value? How do I live by my values? Right. So it's that constant stepping back, but to understand that it's value based, because I talk about the reset mindset as the next generation of the growth mindset, because it's about being more dynamic. It builds on top of a well-researched and Carol Dweck's work of that well-researched and important concept of shifting into that choice. We have to focus on the things that we can control and that we can learn and adapt with effort and persistence. But in today's day and age, it's instead of a foundation of learning, make the foundation value creation, and learning will be a byproduct. So you will want to dynamically be checking in on that creating value. So that little nuance, right, helps us to be more dynamic. And so at the end, to sum it up in just a few words, it's make more reset moments.
Yeah, we're so linked to value. We all want to create value. And until we have the clarity to zoom out and see how we want to create that value, we're confused and unclear, which I know nobody wants to be in that stance. Penny, this has been an excellent conversation to be able to explore everything you're putting out into the world. I'm definitely going to put the book in the show notes for people to check out. One of the ways we like to wrap up the show, because the connected mindset is all around connecting to the things that will help people get to that next level. And this is one of those strategies that they can implement immediately. And then making sure you take action to put it into the world, put it into place and see what happens, and then react and respond from there. So what does being connected or connection mean to you in your current day?
You know, I'm a connector. I love to connect people. I love to connect concepts and ideas and thoughts. Having these kinds of conversations, right? Our thoughts develop. So connection is about that bigger picture, right? It's about the greater consciousness and the greater good and really what comes to my mind when I think of connection is I think of love,
Yeah.
right? And I know that it may sound corny, but there's it, when we're in that place, when we're in our heart, right? Connection is heart. When we're in our heart, everything is easier. Like think about when connection with ourself, right, is gratitude, right? We can connect with others through gratitude, but we can also connect with ourselves. And just that shift in focus, that shift in perspective, it changes our attitudes, our expectations, and our priorities. So that again comes back to aligned action actually comes from connection to ourselves, to others, and to the greater good.
I love that. Thanks so much for shedding some light on that, Penny. It's been a pleasure, and looking forward to continuing the conversation and seeing all the great work that you continue to put out in the world.
Thank you so much.